along at a rate of quite 8 miles the hour. The shore grew dim behind us, and for a long while above the clinging mists I could see the flag that we had planted on the mound. By degrees it dwindled till it became a mere speck and vanished. As it grew smaller my spirits sank, and when it was quite gone I felt very low indeed. "Another of your fool's errands, Allan, my boy," I said to myself. "I wonder how many more you are destined to survive." The others, too, did not seem in the best of spirits. Brother John stared at the horizon, his lips moving as though he were engaged in prayer, and even Stephen was temporarily depressed. Jerry had fallen asleep, as a native generally does when it is warm and he has nothing to do. Mavovo looked very thoughtful. I wondered whether he had been consulting his snake again, but did not ask him. Since the episode of our escape from execution by bow and arrow, I had grown somewhat afraid of that unholy reptile. Next time it might foretell our immediate doom, and if it did I knew that I should believe. As for Hans, he looked very much disturbed, and was engaged in wildly hunting for something in the flap pockets of an antique corduroy waistcoat, which, from its general appearance, must, I imagine, years ago, have adorned the person of a British gamekeeper. "3," I heard him mutter. "By my great-grandfather's spirit, only 3 left." "3 what?" I asked in Dutch. "3 charms, Baas, and there ought to have been quite 24. The rest have fallen out through a hole that the devil himself made in this rotten stuff. Now we shall not die of hunger, and we shall not be shot, and we shall not be drowned, at least none of those things will happen to me, but there are 21 other things that may finish us, as I have lost the charms to ward them off. Thus—" "Oh, stop your rubbish," I said, and fell again into the depths of my uncomfortable reflections. After this I too went to sleep. When I woke it was past midday and the wind was falling. However, it held while we ate some food we had brought with us, after which it died away altogether, and the Pongo people took to their paddles. At my suggestion we offered to help them, for it occurred to me that we might just as well learn how to manage these paddles. So 6 were given to us, and Komba, who now I noted was beginning to speak in a somewhat imperious tone, instructed us in their use. At first we made but a poor hand at the business, but 3 or 4 hours' steady practice taught us a good deal. Indeed, before our journey's end I felt that we should be quite capable of managing a canoe, if ever it became necessary for us to do so. By 3 in the afternoon the shores of the island we were approaching, if it really was an island, a point that I never cleared up, were well in sight, the mountain top that stood some miles inland having been visible for hours. In fact, through my glasses I had been able to make out its configuration almost from the beginning of the voyage. About 5 we entered the mouth of a deep bay fringed on either side with forests, in which were cultivated clearings with small villages of the ordinary African stamp. I observed from the smaller size of the trees adjacent to these clearings that much more land had once been under cultivation here, probably within the last century, and asked Komba why this was so. He answered in an enigmatic sentence which impressed me so much that I find I entered it verbatim into my notebook. "When man dies, corn dies, man is corn, and corn is man." Under this entry I see that I wrote, "Compare the saying, 'Bread is the staff of life.'" I could not get any more out of him. Evidently he referred, however, to a condition of shrinking in the population, a circumstance which he did not care to discuss. After the first few miles the bay narrowed sharply, and at its end came to a point where a stream of no great breadth fell into it. On either side of this stream, that was roughly bridged in many places, stood the town of Rica. It consisted of a great number of large huts roofed with palm leaves and constructed apparently of whitewashed clay, or rather, as we discovered afterwards, of lake mud mixed with chopped straw or grass. Reaching a kind of wharf which was protected from erosion by piles formed of small trees driven into the mud, to which were tied a fleet of canoes, we landed just as the sun was beginning to sink. Our approach had doubtless been observed, for as we drew near the wharf a horn was blown by someone on the shore, whereon a considerable number of men appeared, I suppose out of the huts, and assisted to make the canoe fast. I noted that these all resembled Komba and his companions in build and features. They were so like each other that, except for the difference in their ages, it was difficult to tell them apart. They might all have been members of one family. Indeed, this was practically the case, owing to constant intermarriage carried on for generations. There was something in the appearance of these tall, cold, sharp-featured, white-robed men that chilled my blood, something unnatural, almost inhuman. Here was nothing of the usual African jollity. No one shouted, no one laughed or chattered, no one crowded on us trying to handle our persons or clothes. No one appeared afraid or even astonished. Except for a word or two they were silent, merely contemplating us in a chilling and distant fashion, as though the arrival of three white men in a country where before no white man had ever set foot were an everyday occurrence. Moreover, our personal appearance did not seem to impress them, for they smiled faintly at Brother John's long beard and at my stubbly hair, pointing these out to each other with their slender fingers or with the handles of their big spears. I remarked that they never used the blade of the spear for this purpose, perhaps because they thought that we might take this for a hostile or even a warlike demonstration. It is humiliating to have to add that the only one of our company who seemed to move them to wonder or interest was Hans. His extremely ugly and wrinkled countenance, it was clear, did appeal to them to some extent, perhaps because they had never seen anything in the least like it before, or perhaps for another reason which the reader may guess in due course. At any rate, I heard one of them, pointing to Hans, ask Komba whether the ape-man was our god or only our captain. The compliment seemed to please Hans, who hitherto had never been looked on as either a god or a captain. But the rest of us were not flattered. Indeed, Mavovo was indignant, and told Hans outright that if he heard any more such talk he would beat him before these people, to show them that he was neither a captain nor a god. "Wait till I claim to be either, O butcher of a Zulu, before you threaten to treat me thus," ejaculated Hans indignantly. Then he added with his peculiar Hottentot snigger, "Still it is true that before all the meat is eaten, i.e. before all is done, you may think me both." A dark saying which at the time we did not understand. When we had landed and collected our belongings, Komba told us to follow him, and led us up a wide street that was very tidily kept, and bordered on either side by the large huts whereof I have spoken. Each of these huts stood in a fenced garden of its own, a thing I have rarely seen elsewhere in Africa. The result of this arrangement was that although as a matter of fact it had but a comparatively small population, the area covered by Rica was very great. The town, by the way, was not surrounded with any wall or other fortification, which showed that the inhabitants feared no attack. The waters of the lake were their defence. For the rest, the chief characteristic of this place was the silence that brooded there. Apparently they kept no dogs, for none barked, and no poultry, for I never heard a cock crow in Pongo-land. Cattle and native sheep they had in abundance, but as they did not fear any enemy, these were pastured outside the town, their milk and meat being brought in as required. A considerable number of people were gathered to observe us, not in a crowd, but in little family groups which collected separately at the gates of the gardens. For the most part these consisted of a man and one or more wives, finely formed and handsome women. Sometimes they had children with them, but these were very few. The most I saw with any one family was 3, and many seemed to possess none at all. Both the women and the children, like the men, were decently clothed in long white garments, another peculiarity which showed that these natives were no ordinary African savages. Oh, I can see Rica town now after all these many years. The wide street swept and garnished, the brown-roofed, white-walled huts in their fertile, irrigated gardens, the tall, silent folk, the smoke from the cooking fires rising straight as a line in the still air, the graceful palms and other tropical trees, and at the head of the street, far away to the north, the rounded, towering shape of the forest-clad mountain that was called House of the Gods. Often that vision comes back to me in my sleep, or at times in my waking hours when some heavy odour reminds me of the overpowering scent of the great trumpet-like blooms which hung in profusion upon broad-leaved bushes that were planted in almost every garden. On we marched, till at last we reached a tall live fence that was covered with brilliant scarlet flowers, arriving at its gate just as the last red glow of day faded from the sky and night began to fall. Komba pushed open the gate, revealing a scene that none of us are likely to forget. The fence enclosed about an acre of ground of which the back part was occupied by two large